Jen and Cam are two funny ladies who like to talk about murder, mass murder, murder-suicide, serial killers, spree killers, thrill killers, contract killings, honor killings, and a whole lot of other shit too heinous for me to list here. If you're disturbed by this sort of content, you may want to listen to something else. And if you're a child trying to listen to our true crime podcast, well, you better ask your mama.
Hi, Jen.
Hey, Cam. How are you?
I'm really pretty darn good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
That sounded ridiculous on my part. I apologize. I hear you have a case for us today.
I do. It is a decades-old unsolved mystery.
Ooh.
And all the credit for this goes to Loretta Allen. I had never heard of this case before. And she's like, hey, since Valentine's Day is coming up, I've got the perfect case. And I'm like, you go for it, girly. And she did. So, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Visible from I-85 in Durham, North Carolina, Watts School of Nursing was first organized and incorporated in 1895 as part of Watts Hospital. Its first graduating class was in 1897, and that tradition has continued to the present day. So in 1969, when Patricia Mann of Sanford, North Carolina, graduated from high school, Watts was her school of choice. Her boyfriend, Jesse, a year younger, had chosen North Carolina State University. The couple was used to being separated since they had always lived in separate towns and attended separate high schools. It was February 1971, and the Watts School of Nursing was hosting a Valentine's dance. Patricia really wanted to go, but it wasn't Jesse's weekend to use the family car. Disappointed, Patricia settled in for the evening. Jesse knew how much Patricia wanted to go to the dance, and so he switched weekends with his brother, got the car, and showed up at her dorm and to surprise her. Unfortunately, this heartwarming, considerate gesture would end in tragedy. Jesse McBane grew up in Pittsburgh, North Carolina, a small town of about 5,000 people in the center of the state. Pittsburgh is clean, tidy, and surrounded by green, flat land. He was a big, strapping guy at 6'2", with dark hair and a wide, congenial smile and a classic Hollywood chin. Born on February 15, 1952, in Chatham County, Jesse was the all-American good guy. His family had been in the area for at least 5 generations. He played Hansel in the school play in 1960. He was a pallbearer at his grandfather's funeral in 1970 and was captain of the football team. By all accounts, Jesse had a great sense of humor and loved a good prank. He was voted most likely to succeed. He was in student government, and when it came time to choose a career path, he chose to study the textile sciences. He met Patricia Ann on a blind date. A mutual acquaintance had introduced them, and sparks flew instantly. Patricia was born February 6, 1951, in Sanford, Lee County, North Carolina, about 20 miles south of where Jesse lived. Blonde and pretty with a big, toothy smile, she was just a tiny wisp of a girl, barely reaching Jesse's shoulders. She grew up on Hill Avenue in a neighborhood with lots of space between its cute cottages. No sidewalks, and a big, tall pines and maple trees towering over the houses. Much of her extended family lived within blocks of each other. Aunts, uncles, and grandparents were all within walking distance. Her cousin, Carolyn, lived right across the street, and they spent their days playing together and having sleepovers. The two went to school together and, in general, were inseparable. It was almost like having extra parents and extra siblings at your fingertips. Carolyn often double-dated with Patricia and Jesse, and by most accounts, Jesse and Patricia were known as lovebirds and a fantastic couple. And also, just a little FYI, Patricia and Jesse, or I should actually say Jesse, introduced Carolyn to her future husband. They couldn't see each other very often because Jesse shared a car with his brother, and they both attended school during the week. The couple couldn't even talk on the phone because even though they were only about a half an hour away from each other, it was across county lines, and back then, as you know, it would have been long distance to call each other, so the fees would have been high to call. Remember how much it would couldn't call long distance or because it would charge so much. So they communicated mainly by writing letters back and forth. On the weekends that Jesse had the car, he would drive south along the thick, tree-lined 501 and across the deep river to visit Patricia. He even bought her a promise ring. When graduation came, Patricia and her cousin Carolyn applied to the Watts School of Nursing, but only Patricia got accepted. Patricia didn't want to go because she couldn't imagine being separated from Carolyn and all of her family, but Carolyn insisted that Patricia attend Watts School of Nursing without her, and so Patricia did. At first, college was quite an adjustment for Patricia since she lived in a dorm with a house mother who ran the place like a drill sergeant. The curfew was a strict 11 p.m., but Patricia was known as a rule follower and never got into trouble. Everybody at the school liked Patricia, and she soon got used to her new way of life. It's quite an adjustment going away.
It is.
On the night of the Valentine's dance, when Jesse showed up unexpectedly, Patricia was over the moon. Patricia's roommate, Gail, who had gone to high school with Patricia, said that she was so excited that she was literally hopping around the room while she got dressed. The couple went to the dance and had a great time. And on that night, February 12th, 1971, the school had relaxed their curfew time to 1 a.m. So Patricia signed out of the school at 11:30, and she and Jesse went to the local Lover's Lane. The area they went to, Wayside Place in Crossdale, was used to many students at the school. The students would go there to park, just to find some alone time since they couldn't have boys in their dorm room. Wayside was a known construction area near a golf course, and the cul-de-sacs had been built and not the houses. So many of the nursing students, that wanted the private time with their boyfriends, and they would go and find a cul-de-sac. And if one was taken, they'd go to find another cul-de-sac, right? So that's what they did. So it wasn't technically a lover's lane where everybody parked one by, what you see in Hollywood movies. This was, you would just go find an empty cul-de-sac and park. That night was wet and cold and black as pitch. Just a miserable night to go missing. The next morning, when Patricia had not returned to her dorm, her roommate knew immediately that something was wrong. Patricia's friends and fellow students called the hospitals to see if the pair had been in an accident, and then they tried to report them missing to the police. And, as was so often the case, the police didn't take them seriously. The authorities said Jesse and Patricia probably had just run off together, maybe to elope. Only there wasn't any reason to elope. Their families had given their blessings for the couple to get married the following summer, and friends all reported that the couple had outwardly talked about having a big wedding. And Patricia, she was extremely family-focused and would never rob her family of a beautiful wedding day. Still, the police said that unless there was evidence of foul play, there was nothing that they could do for now, or nothing they would do for now. Knowing something was wrong, fellow nursing students and friends began searching the neighborhood and found Jesse's abandoned car at Medford Road and the Wayside Place cul-de-sac. Today it is a gorgeous, pristine neighborhood with large, stately homes on big lots. But once again, back then, it was all under construction. There was no signs of a struggle. The car was parked evenly, and the doors were locked. Inside the car, the couple's coats were neatly folded in the back seat. Later, the police would determine that there was no foreign fingerprints left in the car either. Her friends had to get in the car by, remember those little triangle windows in the front window that they had to pop open? Yeah. They had to pop that open and stick. That's how they got in the car. Yeah. On February 25th, in a dense thicket of trees just across the Durham County border in Orange County, a land surveyor found what he thought was a mannequin leg covered with leaves deep in the woods near Cedar Creek Drive and Howe Street. But as we all know, it's never a mannequin. And land surveyor finding a body is new. It's usually hunters, joggers, mushroom hunters. Yeah, right? This was
out on a walk, taking a leisurely stroll.
This was a land surveyor. And it was less than 4 miles from where Jesse's car had been found. But because it was in Orange County instead of Durham County, that area hadn't been searched. Tied to an oak tree, covered by leaves and debris, were the bodies of Jesse McBane and Patricia Mann. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and a rope was around their necks. Both were fully dressed with no indication of sexual assault on either victim. The chief medical examiner in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, gives a gruesome and heartbreaking account of what unfolded. It reads, quote, We arrived at the scene at about 4:40 p.m. The bodies were found situated off a one-track dirt road about half a mile from the Carolyn Motor Court off Sparger Road. The bodies were covered with a pile of leaves, and both bodies were tied to a tree trunk. The only visible parts of the bodies were the left leg and thigh and both feet and shoes of the female, and the right hand and face of the male. The hands of both the victims were tied with a hemp rope. The neck of each victim was tightly tied with the same type of rope. Both the bodies were fully clothed with shoes on. The rope tying both bodies together and going around the trunk of the tree. We cut it to separate the bodies, meaning they cut the rope to separate the bodies. The bodies were lying with the head of each victim lying close to the other and the legs away from one another. The trunk of the tree was between the bodies at about waist level, and there was a small amount of blood under each face. The autopsies were started at about 7:15 p.m., and the report goes on to state that the rope around Jesse's neck was tied with a double knot in the front. 2 loops went around each wrist. Jesse had abrasions and contusions on the face, especially in the gum tissue below the lower teeth extended to the lower lip. Petechial hemorrhaging was evident in both victims' eyes and mouths. Both bodies had stab wounds, but the wounds were shallow and made with something round like an ice pick or a screwdriver. They were not deep enough to have contributed to their deaths. Authorities believe those puncture wounds were inflicted by the killer to make sure the couple was dead before leaving the scene. The coroner also came to the conclusion that Jesse and Patricia had been strangled more than once, and judging by the multiple rope marks on their neck, it's like the killer toyed with them before actually killing them. So, in other words, the killer strangled them to the point of death, then loosened the ropes and started all over again.
Ugh.
With Jesse and Patricia's arms secured, the only thing that they could do to fight was with their feet, and it was evident by the grooves on the ground around their bodies. The red mud was still caked on their shoes in the evidence bag. And you know what I'm saying, right? The killer was behind them, choking them, so they were digging in their feet so they can go with him instead of pulling forward.
Ugh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like if somebody chokes you, you try to go back so you're not...
Yeah, you're trying to get, you're
kind of away as much as you can, like you're going back.
Yeah, the pressure away from it. Yeah.
Correct, okay. Immediately, authorities ruled out robbery as a motive, as Jesse was found with $4.63 in his pocket, and he was still wearing a watch and his cufflinks, and he still had his wallet containing his bank card. Patricia had a few more injuries than Jesse, as she had a laceration to the liver and a contusion just to the right side of her spine, most likely from being punched or kicked. The toxicology report was clean. Not only had they not partaken in any illegal substances on their own accord, but their killer had not subdued them with any kind of narcotics either. Orange County Sheriff, the Durham Police, the State Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI all investigated this case, but nobody coordinated with the other. However, all involved believed that the suspect or suspects knew the area and knew that he would not be interrupted. The FBI profile of the suspected perpetrator suggests that he was highly educated and acted alone. However, for a long time, investigators believed that there would probably need to be 2 people involved. They didn't feel as though one person could have tied those elaborate knots in the dark, and that it was possible that another person held the flashlight while the other one did tie the knots and possibly kill them. They also thought that Jesse was big enough that he could have overpowered one person, but probably would have been less likely to attempt anything if there had been 2 perpetrators, especially if those perpetrators were holding guns on them.
That's what I was just going to say. Plus, not only the gun thing, depending on what they say, you're not going to get hurt if you go along with what we tell you to do.
Right. We just, agree.
I mean, nobody knows how things, you know what I mean? If
you're
not
expect
there, you don't
to be
know.
Murdered.
No.
Especially
exactly.
in a small town, right?
No.
However, one of the investigators realized that the crime could have been done by one perpetrator if he had just parked the car with the headlights shining towards them to give him enough light. So from then on, most investigators believed that this crime had been committed by one person. The truly frustrating part about this case is that from the get-go, there was no physical evidence and no real suspects. And that has changed very little over the years. At one point, investigators thought that they may have had a Zodiac copy killer simply because they couldn't find any enemies of either victim, nor could they find a motive. In most cases like this, there's usually some apparent reason: robbery, revenge, sexual gratification. Thrill killers, the ones that kill for no obvious motivation other than just for the fun of it, are actually pretty rare. Now, the infamous Zodiac killer's last known victim was in 1969. And not only was the case reported nationwide and getting plenty of attention, but a movie called The Zodiac Killer had just been released in January, the month before the murders of Jesse and Patricia. The fact that these murders seemed completely random with no real motivation lends a lot of credence to these two being victims of a copycat killer. And it is also thought that Jesse and Patricia may have been the last victims of serial killer William J. Pierce, who was arrested just 3 weeks after their murders on March 9th, 1971 in Georgia. William Jr. Pierce was arrested and convicted of the murders of 9 people. Those crimes occurred from June of 1970 to January of 1971 throughout 3 southern states. Those states were Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. However, robbery was usually his motivation, and he often raped his female victims.
So that was his prime motivation, was robbery, and then he would rape?
Right. With Jesse and Patricia, there didn't seem to be any motivation whatsoever. So aside from William Pierce or a Zodiac copycat, authorities investigated the local satanic cults and even a biker gang called the Stormtroopers. They also investigated a pen pal that Patricia had from Vietnam, who had returned from the States and was living in Louisiana. All of them were ruled out. And there are so many questions. I mean, with this, was this a planned murder? Did the perpetrator drive around the neighborhood waiting for the opportunity to find unsuspecting victims? And whoever it was clearly had ropes already in their car. And did he have them for his job? Did he just buy it for work around the house? Or was this all premeditated? And was he just prepared in case he happened on potential victims? Or was Jesse and Patricia his targets from the get-go?
I would say targets. What do you think?
I'm not really for sure, to be quite honest. Patricia's cousin, Carolyn, said that she saw Patricia on a visit shortly before the murders and that Patricia had started crying. Carolyn was shocked by the outburst and everything seemed to be going well for Patricia. So she asked her cousin what was wrong, and before Patricia got a chance to answer, they were interrupted, and Carolyn never found out what was going on. Many rumors swirled around the investigation. The one with the most traction was that Patricia had stumbled upon a doctor stealing medicine from the hospital and threatened to report him. People wondered if the doctor had killed her in an attempt to keep her from turning him into the police. And even if that were true, authorities could not understand why this unnamed doctor would wait until Patricia's 6'2" football-playing boyfriend would be with her. This would mean that he would have to have subdued and killed 2 people instead of one tiny wisp of a girl. Young woman, I should say. Woman, she was 20. The residents of Watts Nursing School were under lock and key. It's not as if the killer couldn't have caught her out alone on many occasions. And probably the most important question authorities had was, if a doctor was worried about Patricia reporting him to the police, would he have really tortured her? Why not just kill her and throw her into the nearest river and be done with it? It was the presentation of the bodies and the level of violence and torture that made some people think it had to be something other than just a doctor covering his tracks. Another rumor was that there was a doctor who made advances on Patricia that she had rebuffed. Now, that scenario may have seemed more likely to some, but if it were a spurned suitor, wouldn't the crime itself been more sexual? And wouldn't his jealous rage be focused more on Jesse? Still, this is a theory that can't be ruled out. Authorities eventually came up with a list of suspects. All these years later, the following 3 suspects have never been ruled out and are the ones that authorities think are the most likely culprits. Are you ready? There's 3. 2 are dead, 1 still alive. Let me just put that out there. The first suspect is James Brandon Ray. Ray was one of those guys that never seemed to be able to catch a break for one reason or the other. He had an early arrest when he was younger, and he spent the rest of his life breaking parole and doing one stupid thing after another that would just land himself back in jail for short periods of time. He was known to have a red and blue light on his vehicle, and he liked to pose as a police officer. So that could have been a reason to get the kids out of the car. Just saying. Because you would get out of the car, just like Bridget Drawbry, right?
Yes, you would.
When he was arrested for a motor accident, the police found a fake badge, a black wig, photos and articles about the murder of Patricia and Jesse, and the keys to Ward K at Watts Hospital, which was the same ward that Patricia worked on. He also sold his car the day after the bodies were discovered. Suspicious. People who knew him said that his behavior changed after the night the victims went missing, and that he had been fired from Watts Hospital 2 weeks before the murder. Maybe he was the one who Patricia caught stealing the drugs or caught doing something else that could have gotten him fired. Mm-hmm. And remember, that drug thing is just all a big rumor that goes throughout the town. There's no concrete evidence on that, but that would make sense. James Ray also ran out of gas on the night of the dance in the Crossdale neighborhood right around midnight, so he most likely saw Jesse's car on Medford Road. The thing about James Brandon Ray is that he had absolutely no history of violence, none at all, nor was he reported even to have been abusive. He had no drug history, just stupid crimes, right? Authorities questioned whether or not James Ray would have neglected to make sure he had a full tank of gas on the night that he was going to follow and murder 2 college students. I mean, he would have been pretty dumb if that happened. Don't you think?
I don't know.
This makes the police and everyone wonder if James Ray's strange behavior was because he actually witnessed the abduction of Jesse and Patricia. Because he was in the area. He could have seen it happen. He could have known who did it. Maybe he could have helped. I don't know. The second suspect was Dr. James Stephen Walter Wilson, a witness who attended a dinner party with Dr. Wilson the night of the Valentine's Day murders said that he didn't show up for his own dinner until after midnight. The dinner party was hosted by he and his wife at his own house. So Dr. Wilson had a dinner party that Dr. Wilson came to at midnight.
Where did he say he was? We don't know.
When he finally arrived, he was erratic and looking out the windows as if he was being followed.
Interesting.
And the Wilsons lived just a fourth of a mile from the crime scene. Now, I'm not sure if there was like a reason, but he was a doctor, so he could have said, I was held up at work. But I don't know. Mm-hmm. Dr. Wilson was intelligent, vindictive, and arrogant with a history of violence. He was known to have a thing for blondes, and there was a rumor that he had a personal vendetta against Patricia. He often inserted himself into high-profile situations that he had nothing to do with, and couldn't have had anything to do with, one of which was 9/11. Like, he told people that he was there helping out in some way, either with the survivors or, and his sister even calls him a pathological liar. Yeah, his sister even calls him a pathological liar, you know? He once even claimed that he had been questioned by police in Kentucky for the strangulation and murder of Betty Gale Brown. But when the Kentucky police were called, they said that he had never been questioned. Mm-hmm. So he was a bit of a pathological liar.
Seems like it.
Dr. Wilson was just violent and narcissistic enough and off balance, we can say, enough that some believing that he could kill Patricia and Jesse in a violent rage. I mean, that wouldn't have been a far off thing for him to do for people.
That's such a violent way, though. Not like just like losing your junk on him one day. Yeah.
Exactly. However, maybe his bizarre behavior that night was because he too had witnessed something. And considering the proximity of his house to the body dump site, maybe he followed the killer into the woods and witnessed something he shouldn't have.
Wouldn't you come forward, though? I couldn't live with myself.
Well,
Unless he was doing something he shouldn't be then either. But
the last suspect is also a doctor, and he's the one that's still alive. His name is Dr. Robert Carl Britt. In 1973, while imitating a police officer, he tried to abduct 2 teenagers at gunpoint because they had made him angry. They were like hitchhiking on the side of the road, and the one was like swearing at cars or something like that. And he got mad and he came out and he's like, get in the car. I'm a police officer. Yeah. He's bad news. Let's just put it that way. In 1995, he attacked and beat a woman in a road rage incident, although he claimed that she had attacked him. And in none of these instances did the medical board ever take his license away or reprimand him.
Someone's got a little anger problem. I think they need a little anger management. And I don't know, I guess because that's not really directly involved with his doctoring, that you wouldn't necessarily take that away. But I guess.
But if you beat a woman?
I'm trying to think. Like, similar to maybe being an alcoholic, you would send them.
You would think there'd be a code of conduct for
or treatment.
Doctors.
You know, you obviously have this anger problem. We're going to suspend you till you get help or whatever.
I think it would look poorly on the hospital. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but the hospital, Jen, we know this. They like to hide that stuff. They don't want to be responsible for that. So
no charges were ever filed against him for the attempted abductions either. But after being questioned by the police on the abduction attempt on the two teenagers, the ones in 1973, Dr. Britt said, quote, "I hope they catch the guy who tried to abduct those boys. Sounds like the same guy who killed those kids." Meaning,
what?
Had he not said those words, he may have never been suspected in the McBane Mann case. Now, there are reports from coworkers that say Dr. Britt slashed tires, stole other doctors' coats, and threw them in the dumpster and threatened coworkers with a gun. Probably the most distressing of all this is that Jesse McBane's mother said she got a confession call from Dr. Britt. In fact, he'd made several calls to her saying, quote, "I killed your son." But on the last call, he actually identified himself. And when these calls were traced, they were made from a payphone at the mall. Investigators wondered why Dr. Britt, if it were indeed Dr. Britt, why would he call Jesse's parents and confess, but not Patricia's? And is it because Patricia was the intended victim and the killer felt some remorse about killing Jesse? Because, you know, he didn't like women. So one must wonder if a person like Dr. Britt would call and confess to anything, which leads one to suspect that it could have been somebody else calling Jesse's family who either knew or suspected that Dr. Britt was responsible for Jesse's death or was hoping to throw the scent off of their own trail.
That's what I would think. I don't think, knowing what you've said so far, I don't think he's the kind of fellow he doesn't want to call attention to himself.
Well, it's no secret that Dr. Britt had real issues with women, and especially women of authority. When the current investigation on this case went to question Dr. Britt recently, they asked for his DNA sample, and the investigators said that he was visibly shaking and refused to give his DNA. That in and of itself does not mean that he's responsible for Jesse and Patricia's murder. It could just mean that his DNA could be found at other crime scenes that he doesn't want to be connected to. And the shaking that he presented doesn't necessarily mean that he was scared. Could have meant that he was just angry. Not for sure, though. And in a mind-blowing twist, in 1976, just a couple days after James Brandon Ray got out of prison, you know, James Brandon Ray was the first suspect. He went to work for Dr. Carl Britt. And
you don't say.
Yeah. Dr. Britt eventually fired James Ray, but it has made authorities wonder if James Braden Ray and Dr. Britt were in on the crime together.
That's exactly what it's a little. I know something
Suspicious.
about you, so you're going to have to give me a job.
Right. Possibly the original suspicions the police had that there was more than one person involved was the right idea. Maybe Ray held the flashlight that night for Dr. Britt. They both like to pretend to be police officers. I don't know. Patricia had taken her state board test the day she went missing, and her roommate Gail commented on how long it had taken her. It was a half an hour after her roommate had finished taking her own test, and she commented on how Patricia seemed distracted. And if only Patricia had said something to somebody about what was troubling her. Remember, Carolyn noticed she was crying and upset, you know? And it's possible that those tears she shed and the distraction she experienced while taking her test had absolutely nothing to do with the person who would end up killing her. Could be entirely unrelated, and maybe the killer wasn't even the three main suspects at all. We don't know. Shortly after the murders of Jesse and Patricia, there was an attempted abduction on another couple in the same area in 1972. The couple, who were also at Lover's Lane, were forced at gunpoint to drive a man to a specific location. When the abductor ordered the male victim into the trunk, he refused to go, causing the abductor to strike him on the head with the butt of his gun. Eventually, the perpetrator took off in his car. A composite sketch was made of their kidnapper, and the investigators do say it resembles one of the main suspects in this case. Still, the resemblance was not enough to get a court to issue a warrant for a DNA collection. Now, could this person have been Jesse and Patricia's killer? It leads one to wonder whether Jesse and Patricia's killer had abducted or killed before, and whether or not the killer could have even stopped killing. In the end, we are left with questions rather than answers, and agonizing doubt as to whether any of these suspects were responsible, and if any justice will ever be served, as possible witnesses and suspects are reaching the ends of their natural lives. We are left with the haunting absence of two wonderful humans, full of promise and hope. How many people could Patricia have helped in her nursing career, right?
Mm-hmm.
The devastation felt by all who knew them lingered for decades. Jesse McBane's funeral was at 2 p.m. on his hometown of Pittsboro, North Carolina. The church was packed with family and friends, and not a dry eye in attendance. Those same attendees had to leave his funeral and drive quickly to Sanford to make the funeral of Patricia at 4 p.m. I'm having to attend 2 funerals in one day. Must have been insurmountable, horrible, exhausting. I mean, emotionally. Patricia signed Jesse's senior yearbook with a long, wonderful inscription about their hopes and dreams and their love for one another. The last 3 lines go like this. Quote, "We will outlive these long periods of separation. We are both strong-willed and know what we want. We can outlive anything and anyone." That's it. If you have any information, no matter how small, about the abduction, the torture, murder of Jesse McBane and Patricia Mann, please contact the Orange County Sheriff's Department at 919-644-3050 or visit the Orange County Sheriff's Office's website at www.ocso.com.
I guess what we can hope for is a deathbed confession at this point. Hopefully somebody
what
knows
they
something.
said. That's the only thing that could happen. I mean, they do have the hemp rope that may have DNA on it. At one point, they were talking about using that MVAC, where they kind of, I think it's like a wet vac type thing. I'm not really sure on the technology. And to get DNA, let me say this real quick, too, before I get in. Much of this information, I will say, was obtained from a long-form podcast that came out in 2018 called The Long Dance. Now, it's by investigative reporter Andrew Adamick and writer-filmmaker Eric Pruitt. They teamed up with Major Tim Horn of the Orange County Sheriff's Department, and he's the guy who reopened the case in 2011. Major Horn is very committed to solving the murders of Jesse and Patricia. Quote, "It takes a very sick person to do something like this. I'll do everything in my power to bring him to justice." And just FYI, he keeps the box of evidence with him in the corner of his office. Like he's committed to this case. I would strongly suggest this podcast. It's a really good podcast. It's 8 episodes long, maybe an hour, a little over an hour each episode. And each suspect is given its own episode. And it delves more into what we did here, because there's so much information. The podcast interviews Carolyn, the cousin best friend of Patricia. It interviews cousins of Jesse. It interviews all the police. It's a very fascinating podcast. And I normally don't listen to any podcasts on the subject that we're covering, but there's hardly any information about this case online. All this information was come to light for this podcast, or this podcast brought it all out front.
Good for them.
I strongly suggest to take 8.5 hours, and listen to it. It's very well done. And
just frustrating,
very
because this seems like a case that could be easily solved. Well, somebody knows something, but
the main suspect that they think is the last suspect. They really think he's the one that could have done it. And they think that he might have been the one in 1972. But you can find that all out in episode 6 of The Long Dance. But it's frustrating because there really isn't a lot of evidence. They have the rope. I don't know. Those poor kids, they were just kids. 19 and 20, they just celebrated birthdays too. Well, hell,
babies.
Jesse's birthday was 3 days after he was murdered.
Oh.
February 15th, I think his birthday was. And he would have turned,
somebody knows something, come up, deathbed confession. I don't know how one could live with themselves committing such a vile act and then just going about their life like everything's fine.
No, horrible. Just horrible. How scared those two must have been. But how else would you get kids out of the car if you didn't pretend you were a police officer? I mean, how...
Or do something to their car to where it would break down and you're following them.
But they were already parked. They were already there.
Yeah.
Or so it seemed, right?
Yeah.
But Jesse was 6'2". He was a football player. I mean, he was a big kid.
Both of them had impersonated officers before, correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And even if you had this bright light, you can buy fake police stuff. So if you had a spotlight and you're automatically going to think that's a police officer.
And a gun, right. And they're good kids. They followed they'd follow any authority figure, I'm sure, as with most kids would. Most people would, Yeah. I don't know. It's
awful. Well, I hope somebody knows something.
It's been how many years now? It's 50. It needs to be solved.
Jen.
That was a quick. I actually did it because of this happened close to when we were born, so I kind of get.
It's terrible,
But honestly, do listen to the podcast, The Long Dance. It's really good. Like the interviews are really fascinating. I mean, they've got that. All the people have that Southern drawl, and they're the older folk, and it's really interesting. It's
maybe
good.
I'll check that out today.
You should. It's really good.
I just may.
And like I said, each of these suspects have their own episode, which is about an hour long. So it goes more into deep about who they are. Like they talked to...
Let's give that podcast another plug. What's the name of it?
The Long Dance. I will have it in the show notes.
There you go.
But they talked to Dr. Wilson's sister, and she's like, they had quit speaking like a long time ago. They didn't speak to each other any longer. Did she say
she thought he did it?
She didn't, but she did say he was a pathological liar.
Oh.
She did. I mean, they had her problems. Like it sounded like at the very beginning, she didn't even want to talk because it was like, it was a long time ago, I just don't want to dredge this up. It's very interesting.
Good job, Jen.
Thanks.
And
good job, Loretta. This was all Loretta. This was her story. This was her writing. This is everything.
Never heard of that either. So.
I know. I haven't either. And supposedly it's like one of the biggest unsolved mystery or unsolved cases in that area.
I would think so. That's terrible.
So young. And they were just as cute as can be. Seriously, they were so cute.
The babies.
She had the little white from the pictures, because they're older pictures, like the white blonde bouffant hairdo with the curls at the bottom, and he was tall, strapping, good looking, dark hair. Not that their looks matter at all. It's still tragic, but it's just like she's like the one that I saw, she's like in this white dress, and it almost looks like a wedding picture, and it broke my heart.
It's heartbreaking. It is.
I hate these unsolved ones. I hate it. I hate them.
I do too, which is ironic.
They're fascinating, though.
That's what I have for next week.
Oh, you do? Another one?
I do, back to back. But woo, I don't, it just bugs me. It bugs me.
It does.
Like I literally lay awake at night and think.
I know.
It just bugs me.
I know. And this DNA, supposedly they have DNA from all these suspects too. So if they could just if there's just DNA on that rope, if they can get DNA from that rope. Supposedly, like in 2018, something happened, but I wasn't able to find any outcome of that. But I don't know. And I haven't even looked up any pictures of the sheriff guy, Tim Horn. But I kind of have a little crush on him just hearing him talk. It's that Southern thing.
Jennifer!
I know. There's just something funny about that Southern thing, and he's confident. And
I'm going to have to go watch it now just for that.
I know. I don't even know what he looks like. I didn't even look him up.
Google him.
I can, but I haven't. I don't know. But just his speech and the way the confidence of how he talks, and just kind of like, I kind of like him. I like him a lot.
Yeah.
So
I get that.
Yeah. If you want another good podcast besides ours, which you are always more than welcome to leave us a nice review on. But what other podcast do you like? The Long Dance was the latest one. Our friends, hold on.
Javier from Pretend. John from Criminal Conduct. We're meeting,
And Twisted.
hanging out with them next week, and Twisted. Yep. Come on, Eileen. Yeah. Come on, Eileen.
Our friends, I should say, Eileen McFarlane, and she does Crime Lapse. And our friend Emily from Morbidology just wrote a new long-form podcast by the name of Devil in the Dorm.
Oh.
It is it's from Law and Crime Network, and it's a dark story about sex trafficking, a cult leader, and a stunned college campus.
Oh.
It's about the guy who goes to a band by the name of Larry Ray, who moved into his daughter's college dorm at Sarah Lawrence and spent the next decade controlling her friends under what may have been described as a sex cult. 6-part series. Yes.
That's going to be a must listen for me. Let me tell you right now.
It is. I mean, and Eileen is wonderful, as is Emily. I mean, not only are they both really smart, wonderful women, they both write really well. So it's definitely a listen.
Yeah.
Devil in the Dorm.
Well, good.
Is the name of it. And it's a Wondery.
Wondery.
All
right. I'm on it.
Yep.
So I guess until next week, Jen.
Yep.
Remember, lock your doors.
And keep passing by those open windows.
Bye-bye.
Love ya. For more information about this episode, as well as all other sources, please check out our show notes or the podcast website at ourtruecrimepodcast.com. Our True Crime Podcast is developed and created by the hosts, Jen and Cam. Original music and audio mix of all our True Crime Podcast episodes is courtesy of Nico Vertesi from We Talk of Dreams. You can reach Nico at wetalkofdreams.com. Listener discretion is provided by Edward October from OctoberPod VHS. You can find all of his great works on YouTube. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our True Crime Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We can be reached on Instagram and Facebook at Our True Crime Podcast, or on Twitter with the handle at Our True Crime Pod. You can also email us at ourtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. We would also at this time like to thank our patrons. We would be so lost without you. Thank you so much. And if you would like to help support the show, you can check us out on patreon.com/Our True Crime Podcast. You can also show your support by leaving a 5-star review on Apple, or simply just tell your friends about us. It's that easy. Love ya.